Speaker Series this evening. Before we start with the main event, just a few housekeeping things. We do have some restrooms located just down the hallway, just to the left of the elevator. If you would please sign in, that would help us advocate for continuing these kind of events in the future. And we do have water in the back if you are interested. This event is being live streamed on Facebook this evening. A recording of this event will be posted to our YouTube page if you know anybody that will be interested in it in the future. The format of this presentation will be our speaker will talk for about 30 to 45 minutes, and it'll be followed by a question and answer section. If you are joining us via Facebook, please type your questions into the chat box and we'll get to them as the time permits. This is a speaker series, a year-long series that is focusing on Wyoming and our diverse communities and histories. It is held the second Thursday of every month at 7 p.m. The only month we don't have something scheduled is actually next month. We are taking a break. So now for the main event, I am pleased to introduce Brian Beauvais, who is a Wyoming historian. He is the curator at the Park County Archives in Cody, Wyoming. He has a master's degree in history and is currently working towards a Master of Science in Library Science degree. He is a member of the Park County Historical Preservation Commission. In addition to his archival research interests, Beauvais also loves exploring the historical geography of Park County to better understand and recount the unfrequented stories that endure throughout our local landscape. Tonight's talk is on the history of bear hunting here in Wyoming. He will talk about notable bear hunters and their stories, as well as the overall history of bear hunting and its regulations in Wyoming from the 19th century to the present. Bear hunting regulations began in 1903, and the first hunting licenses were issued in 1909. So this talk will touch on the ways in which locals and big game hunters' attitudes identifying bears as predators or game has led to an interesting view on wildlife conservation of bears and how to handle them. So, thank you.
Thanks for coming to this. My name is Brian Beauvais. I'm the curator of the Park County Archives in Cody. I'm not a historian, despite what she just said. I'm an archivist. Those are different things. I deal with historical documents. I don't deal with interpreting history to people, even though I'm up here talking just because I like reading old hunting narratives. First off, I got to say, I know that bear hunting can be a contentious issue. It's especially relevant right now with the issue of delisting grizzlies and all that fun stuff. So if you came here to listen to some angry screed for or against bear hunting, I hate to disappoint you, but this is going to be super boring. So that's not what you're going to get. I also didn't know about the 30 to 40 minute time thing, so we're going to go a little bit over that. What we're going to talk about is the documented history of bear hunting in Wyoming and the conservation laws and policies that go along with that and that apply to bears. And I will admit up front here that I will be biased towards northwest Wyoming, one, because that's where I live and I work, and also because that's sort of the focus of bear hunting in the history of Wyoming, because that's where grizzlies are. And this talk is an outgrowth of some previous talks that I had given about the history of big game hunting and the outfitting industry in northwest Wyoming and wildlife conservation policies in Park County. And during those talks, there was always the topic of bear hunting sort of looming over me, and I never really knew how to deal with it because bears just don't fit into the standard conservation scheme. They're often regarded as being something apart, something different. You know, they're not entirely predators, they're not entirely big game. And maybe it's notable that bears were never outright vermin, like wolves and coyotes. But throughout the years, many ranchers and farmers and people who made a living in rural environments often consider bears to be kind of varmint adjacent, because they do cause problems, and that has always affected bear management policies. But for many non-resident hunters, and bear hunters especially grizzly bear hunters, they often consider them to be the most highly sought-after game species in all of North America. So if you're an early wildlife manager, it's kind of hard to, it's tough to ride the middle line between sort of managing these bears when so many locals regard them as sort of varmints and so many hunters regard them as this sort of super important thing they want to have around. So, to lay the foundation of bears in Wyoming, we have to address a few things. I know this is really elementary. In the lower 48, we have two species of bears, the American black bear, which had a broad historical range from Arctic to Mexico, Atlantic to the Pacific. Still has a broad modern range, largely confined to forests. And then there's grizzly bears, which are just a population subspecies of North American brown bears. And grizzlies used to live from the Arctic down to Mexico, and not much east of the Missouri, maybe a little bit into Iowa and Minnesota, kind of where the Great Plains start becoming the Midwestern prairies. So both of these bears are widespread, and they're part of the landscape to some extent. No matter where you go around the West, no matter where you go in Wyoming, you're going to find bears. And this results in a lot of misperception among historical sources about exactly what kind of bears these people are talking about. Because I hope, as you know, black bears don't always look black, and grizzlies or brown bears don't quite always look brown. And when you read a lot of historical sources about Wyoming wildlife, like I do, you'll hear bears called all kinds of things. Black bears are called brown bears, cinnamon bears, blonde bears. Grizzly bears are silvertips, roachbacks, bald-faced, white-faced bears. So it's super confusing when you're reading old hunting narratives and some guy says he shot a gray bear, a red bear, and a brown bear. You kind of have no idea what the heck they're talking about. So it's hard to make sense of what kind of bears are getting killed. And a lot of these different colorations are sometimes thought to be different population subspecies. Sometimes people think there are like 10 bear species. And our modern distinction between black bears and grizzly bears just really wasn't a thing. In fact, I don't want to get too ahead of myself here, but Wyoming Game and Fish doesn't even recognize two distinct bear species until 1925, and they don't actually manage them differently until 1968. Some Native American tribes hunted bears, never to the extent that they hunted buffalo or other things, but it's not like no bears were ever killed by Native Americans. They had their brand of trophies as well, like this bear claw necklace. But for other tribes, it's super taboo to kill bears. Among the Crow tribe of southern Montana and northern Wyoming, this was the case. It's even taboo to handle grizzly products. So even touching this would be taboo. And there are plenty of stories from the frontier of people in the Crow tribe traveling with white folks. And white folks back then loved to cook with bear oil. And the Crow are just absolutely disgusted by this. They see it as being akin to cannibalism. So it's not like no bears were ever killed by Native Americans. Some tribes killed bears. Some tribes totally left them alone. Now, white folks are obviously familiar with black bears from back east. But before Lewis and Clark, few Europeans, maybe except for the Spanish and Californians, the Southwest, had really encountered grizzly bears and knew what the heck they were. And there's always these rumors of the great yellow bear that were so much bigger and badder than the eastern black bear. And Lewis and Clark found plenty of these bears, great yellow bears, and found them to be extremely dangerous and difficult to kill. they had assumed that Native Americans were so terrified of these things because their bow and arrows just weren't up to the task of taking them down. But then they quickly found out that even their modern rifles had a hard time with these things too. Later, trappers and fur traders in Wyoming run into bears all the time, like Osborne Russell, who wrote this Journal of a Trapper, who spent about a decade trapping in northwest Wyoming. And generally, these mountain men guys really don't care about bears or bear hunting. They're looking for beaver pelts, and certainly sometimes they have real fun encounters with bears. Think here of Leonardo or Euglass. But bears don't really play a big role in the Wyoming fur trade scene. Okay, so where can we actually start talking about bear hunting as a distinct activity? And the history of bear hunting in Wyoming kind of starts with two different stories. One is the story of local Westerners who regularly kill a lot of bears because bears are considered varmints, predators, a threat to livestock. The other story is of visiting hunters who also kill lots of bears because they consider them to be this wonderful trophy animal. And both of these groups, for whatever their reasons, kill lots of bears. And let's start out with locals. These early homesteaders, cowboys, ranchers, shepherds, what have you, look upon bears with super little romance. The mentality of the frontier saw nature as an adversary, something that needed to be tamed, something that would just as well kill you if you didn't kill it first. And it's not to say these folks hated bears, but they perhaps looked upon the prospect of their eventual extermination without really shedding too many tears. Bears represented wilderness, settlers represented civilization, and everywhere you looked in 19th century America, wilderness was seeding ground to civilization, so it's almost a foregone conclusion that bears are going to disappear sometime soon. The state of Wyoming had a bounty on bears in the 1880s, along with bounties on mountain lions, wolves, coyotes, lynx, bobcats, hawks, eagles, all sorts of fun stuff, magpies. One of my favorite topics in Wyoming history were old meat hunters and hide hunters and the market hunting economy that sort of drove a lot of Wyoming informally for a long time. And certainly there's some market hunting of bears, never near to the extent carried out on other animals like buffalo. Bears were not food animals. No one really salivates at the prospect of eating a bear steak. So they're really only valuable for their hides. And even that was a pretty small market. So market hunters don't wipe out bears across the state like they do a lot of other animals. That still leaves bears for people who actually want to hunt bears. And these folks who want to hunt bears are this small, usually wealthy group of people who are bored sitting at home, so bored that they have to go on these extravagant hunts out at the frontier looking for adventure. Now, in the latter half of the 19th century, there are a lot of these guys coming out to Wyoming, going on these hunts. George Gore, the Earl of Dunraven, too many to mention here. One of them is Theodore Roosevelt, who got himself into the mix in 1884, came out to the Bighorns to go elk hunting. He also ended up shooting a grizzly or 2 or 3 or 4, we kind of don't know. I'm not going to go into individual bear hunting stories here, because let's be honest, they're totally all the same. Every bear hunting story is about how the hunter killed the ferocious bear before it killed him. Another historic bear hunter in Wyoming was the Marquis De Moore, and you might know the Marquis if you go to Medora, North Dakota, Theodore Roosevelt National Park. There's that historic site. And he's this extravagant, wealthy, kind of crazy Frenchman who becomes a cattle baron in North Dakota and basically uses his ranch as this lavish hunting outpost on the frontier. He's neighbors with Theodore Roosevelt with his ranch. The two don't really get along too well. even though they're kind of into the same things. Anyway, in 1885, the Marquis and his wife, Medora, and a few other friends arranged this month-long hunt to come out to Wyoming, which was common in those days for these high-profile hunters, who especially want to look for grizzly bears, because grizzly bears are quickly disappearing everywhere else. Now, at the last minute, the Marquis can't go, but his wife, Medora, still wants to go bear hunting without her husband. So the party sets out from North Dakota. They set up their camp on Meeteetse Creek, kind of up here in the western Bighorn Basin. And in those days, there really wasn't much around there besides a few scattered cattle ranches and drunk, wandering cowboys. And unfortunately, we don't have many pictures from this hunt. But we do know they shot 7 bears. The first bear Medora shot, she missed, and her hunting guide had to shoot it for her. The last couple of bears she shot, I also want to say she shot some cubs, which was common back then. People don't differentiate between shooting a cub and a big bear, or a big boar or a sow. It's just a bear is a bear. So the last couple of bears she shot at charged her, and before her guide could, get ready to shoot, she had already reloaded her gun and shot the thing again, and it dies at her feet right before it was going to get her. And even in this very brief account of this hunt, there's this underlying transformation of Medora from this fragile woman who needs her guide to do her hunting for her, to this fearless, ultra-capable bear hunter who can outshoot her own guide. And quick comment, this is the type of personal metamorphosis that we often see in bear hunting stories. It's these types of personal transformations seemingly oddly don't occur when people go elk hunting or deer hunting, but it's the danger of bear hunting that people revel in. And it's suggested that sort of brings out their latent command and mastery of their own abilities that little else in civilized life ever could, where a refined lady could become a real man. Another bear hunter from the 1880s was George Shields, who later became the publisher of Recreation magazine. Here on its first issue, you can see a picture of George Custer with this bear he shot in the Black Hills grizzly bear. Shields and his party are up in northwest Wyoming, in the mountains east of Yellowstone, and they shoot some elk, they shoot a few bears, and I wouldn't even bring up George Shields, but for the fact that he's going to help us start talking about bear traps. Because he recounts a story where a guy and his party kills a bear by setting a gun trap, rigged so that when a bear sort of is in front of this set gun, it pulls the trigger and it shoots itself. And if it wasn't already crystal clear at this point, there are no laws or regulations protecting bears or regulating bear hunting in Wyoming. In the 1880s, the territory had just begun implementing very rudimentary regulations on hunting game animals, and bears still didn't qualify as game animals. So any notion of fair chase does not apply to bear hunting. And trapping bears and various kind of traps is nothing new. It's a historic practice everywhere. It's not like no one ever did it besides in Wyoming. Unlike deer and elk and moose, it's often really difficult to predict where bears are going to be at any given time. So just going out in the woods and looking for bears is a super inefficient hunting method. They're also nocturnal, and they're also dangerous, so people sometimes don't want to hunt bears. But if you can lure a bear into an area and keep it there, you have a much better chance of pulling off a successful bear hunt. And this brings us to yet another bear hunter, Reverend William Stephen Rainsford, who's a prominent Episcopal minister in New York City, and who loved to come out to Wyoming every summer and go on these hunts in the Bighorns and in the Absarokas around Yellowstone. In 1887, he publishes this article in Scribner's magazine recounting his many stories of hunting in northwest Wyoming. And most of what he talks about does not concern us here, except for the fact that he shoots a number of grizzlies, both in the Bighorns, in the Absarokas, and in Yellowstone National Park, back when that was legal until 1883. And he shoots some of these bears in bear traps, which is notable. Now, this is far from my favorite topic to talk about, but this bear hunting method usually works when you have some kind of a bait. If you had killed an elk or a deer, or sometimes just people kill an old lame horse, anything to lure a bear into an area. And then near this bait, you have this large foothold trap, and you anchor it to a downed tree. You can't anchor it in the ground because grizzlies will just tear it up out of the ground. You can't anchor it to a standing tree because it won't give, and the bear's so strong it'll just snap the chain, or it will just rip its paw out of the trap. But if you attach it to a down tree, it can still move around. And if you're a hunter, you just show up to your trap, and if the bear has sprung the trap, it's dragging around a massive tree behind it, so it's pretty easy to just follow the track, and then you find the bear and you shoot it in the trap. And unfortunately, this was a common practice. These traps result in bears that have distinctive tracks because they lost a toe or two, and people can identify these unique tracks, and they sort of get to know these individual bears. And if you're curious, bear trapping is illegal in every state except in Maine. So if you want to go bear trapping, you got to go to Maine. I don't know why it's still legal in Maine. Anyway, this is what Reverend Rainsford does, and he writes about it. And in reading his stories, you can tell there's a little tinge of guilt in this whole thing, because he says, oh, people back east trap bears too. I'm not the only one, and I'm just doing this because my guides who live out here, that's how they shoot bears. So. And Reverend Rainsford's stories aren't super interesting historically. A lot of hunters wrote up and published their hunting stories. But what is important for us is how his stories were received by other hunters, because the reaction said a lot about how bear hunting was changing and how public attitudes towards bears was starting to evolve. After Rainsford's article is published, he starts to get attacked by other hunters. Today, he would have been vehemently canceled on social media, but back in those days, the outrage machine churned a little bit slower. One of those guys is Archibald Rogers, who's a wealthy sportsman from New York. He's also a neighbor of the Theodore Roosevelt clan up on the Hudson. And he also owns a ranch up in northwest Wyoming, comes out every summer to go hunting, like all these guys. And he publishes his hunting stories also, including his bear hunting stories. And Rogers writes this angry letter to the sporting magazine Field and Stream, accusing Rainsford of trapping bears and shooting crippled bears while pretending that it's sport. And he's also upset that people are killing other game animals to use as bait to attract in bears to be shot. Theodore Roosevelt, among others, also writes letters condemning shooting bears in traps. And it's important to note that Archibald Rogers is a charter member of the Boone and Crockett Club, which was founded in 1888 by Theodore Roosevelt and George Bird Grinnell, and whose membership included many wealthy East Coast hunters. And these guys are important because they're some of the first hunters to start pushing for wildlife conservation. And also these ideas of sportsmanship and fair chase, whereby the method of hunting and the authentic experience of hunting is arguably more important than actually killing an animal. And these angry letters by Rogers and others are good evidence that at least some sportsmen thought bears were important and valuable as game animals and maybe shouldn't be treated like lowly vermin. And maybe this suggests bears are starting to gain a little bit of status because people are beginning to speak out in favor of sportsmanship being applied towards bear hunting, which would have been borderline unthinkable only a few decades prior. because many Western settlers just see bear hunting as having a little fun while doing a public service. But we slowly start to see practices around bear hunting change, and it takes a while, but bear trapping is discontinued in Wyoming in the early 1900s. And Archibald Rogers ends his letter by pointing to a guy named William Pickett as the epitome of true sportsmanship when it comes to bear hunting. Which brings us unquestionably to the greatest bear hunter in Wyoming, if not the greatest grizzly bear hunter, one of the greatest grizzly bear hunters in the entire country, that probably most people don't know about. Pickett was born in the South. He was a surveyor and civil engineer who built railroads in the antebellum South. He fought in the Mexican-American War. He fought with the Confederacy in the Civil War. No, he's not the Pickett from Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, although he's somehow related to that Pickett. I don't really like genealogy. So after the Civil War is over, his wife and his 2 daughters died suddenly of scarlet fever. So poor Colonel Pickett, his family dead, his home infested with Yankees, probably a little bit bitter at the world, and he probably just wanted to leave his old life behind. So in 1876, he comes out west to go hunting and explore around with literally nothing to lose. And he kept coming out every spring, hunting around southern Montana and northwest Wyoming. And he eventually builds a ranch on the Graybull River in the Bighorn Basin, a place that he had hunted around for years. And he devotes significantly less time to hunting and more time to local politics and ranching, because he represented Fremont County in the Wyoming legislature back when the Bighorn Basin was part of Fremont County, and he later organized Bighorn County and became the state senator from there. And all this politics is important because Colonel Pickett was one of the first politicians in Wyoming to start getting the ball moving on this novel concept of wildlife conservation, because as a hunter he was seeing wildlife populations were quickly getting sparser, and if no one did anything about it, they'd be completely gone soon. Because he had watched as buffalo were shot out of the state, and he didn't want to see other animals follow. And maybe all this work for game conservation makes it no surprise that Colonel Pickett was also a charter member of the Boone and Crockett Club. He was sort of renowned in early hunting circles and in sporting magazines as this frontier gentleman grizzly hunter. In fact, the Boone and Crockett Club publishes this book, Hunting at High Altitudes, that is largely composed of his hunting stories. And these include stories of bear hunting in Yellowstone National Park, back when it was legal. He would kill like 20 or 30 bears a year, mostly grizzlies. And he killed so many bears that most only warranted a sentence or two in his stories. And you can, in fact, sort of sense him getting bored with shooting bears that don't provide any action, which the vast majority don't, because one thing bear hunters do is they always overemphasize how ferocious bears are. Perhaps his greatest boast was this incident where he killed 4 bears in one night over a pile of dead cattle. And of course, he's a civil engineer and a veteran, so he draws up this battlefield map to lay out the action. It's also maybe why he likes hunting bears, because of the danger and the battleness of it. And Colonel Pickett is respected as a prolific grizzly hunter because he does not use traps. But we should acknowledge that most of the bears he shoots, he shoots over some kind of bait. Whether that be, in this case, a pile of beeves, or in many cases it's an elk carcass, or some other thing that is dead and rotting. And bear baiting is still a common practice in many places. Obviously, you can't use elk or other game, but you can use unprocessed parts of livestock. And it can be a controversial issue. In the 1990s, the Forest Service proposed discontinuing permits for bear hunting, but not outlawing the activity altogether. And this caused some hubbub because bear hunters thought it would be exceptionally hard to shoot bears without bait because they're largely nocturnal. Currently in Wyoming, bear baiting is legal except in parts of northwest Wyoming in the Grizzly conservation area and in any wilderness designated area on national forests. So that's bear baiting. In 1900, the nature writer Ernest Thompson Seton publishes this book, The Biography of a Grizzly, which takes place in northwest Wyoming and around Yellowstone. And in this book, he casts Colonel Pickett as this evil, bear-murdering cattle rancher. And Pickett did kill more than his fair share of Wyoming grizzlies, but he wasn't an evil guy. He wasn't bloodthirsty. Again, in those days, people just saw bears as an animal that needed to be thinned out, something that didn't really need protection. And even while Pickett worked to implement all of these wildlife conservation policies, he certainly didn't mean those policies to apply to bears. So guys like Colonel Pickett, Reverend Rainsford, Archibald Rogers, and so many others truly did some serious damage to Wyoming bear populations in the latter half of the 19th century. So much so that Wyoming actually initiates its first bear hunting law. In 1903, it becomes illegal to hunt bears on national forests except during the open season. Back then, there used to be one open season for all game. So bears were classified as game animals on forests, and you have to purchase a general hunting license. Again, back in those days, you just purchased one license, and different animals were on that. It wasn't broken up into individual special permits like it is today. And they're also classified as predators in the rest of the state off national forests, which means you can hunt them anytime, there is no season, you don't need a license. But just the fact that they're even protecting them in small areas, we start to see Wyoming very slowly start to actually manage bear hunting. Now, early bear hunters like Colonel Pickett demonstrated their hunting skills by killing lots of bears. But by the early 1900s, it's just no longer possible to kill lots of bears because people have been killing lots of bears for a while now, and there just aren't lots of bears left to kill. So how do you become a good hunter when the standard for hunting is killing lots of bears? There are no longer any bears. So the rules of the game are adapted and to these new circumstances. And bear hunting goes from being about killing a lot of bears to about killing the biggest, gnarliest single bear. And this is true for bear hunting, but it's also a larger hunting phenomenon because most big game animals are at historic lows in their populations around the turn of the century, and it's just no longer possible to hunt at the rate people had been hunting a few decades prior. And this growing ideal of sportsmanship is also important here because promoters of sportsmanship shunned excessive killing just for numbers, and instead they emphasized a type of hunting that challenged your skills and only killing qualified or crafty animals that were worthy opponents. And to some extent, we take this attitude for granted today because it's almost baked into our hunting laws. But in this new scheme, killing 10 regular bears paled in comparison to killing one large, intelligent bear that outwitted humans long enough to grow that big. And that's where we get bears like Old Four Toes, who was a notorious bear in the Jackson Hole area. And people knew this bear because it had lost a toe in a trap back in 1885. And people could identify and follow its unique tracks around Jackson. And the story goes that Old Four Toes was so angry at humanity that he took his rage out on the livestock of Jackson Hole, and he was too shrewd and devious to be caught by the hunters who were always after him. But in 1905, Mr. Fred Chase and Charlie Workman here, who were a couple of old cowboys, outfitters, saloon keepers out of Cody, were guiding some eastern hunters in the Buffalo Forks region, northeast of Jackson. And they came upon the tracks of Old Four Toes, and they knew it was him. So, of course, they followed the tracks, found the bear, shot it 12 times, not before it charged them. It died right at their feet. We've heard the story before. The pelt weighed about 300 pounds. It was 12 feet long, almost 10 feet wide. The fat on the back was about 7 inches deep, and they got almost 20 gallons of oil from the thing. And they ended up selling the hide to some guy down in Denver because it probably brought a pretty good price and made one of the best bearskin rugs that anyone ever had. Okay, so the next trend in bear hunting is coursing bears with packs of dogs. This was seen as a more active and lively form as opposed to the passive strategy of just watching bait and waiting for a bear to perhaps show up, which might be considered pretty damn boring. The history of coursing animals with dogs is super old. Today, people use dogs to track mountain lions, but for centuries, for thousands of years, people use dogs to course wolves, bears, wild pigs, even deer, elk, and antelope. I think if you have an Irish wolfhound or a Scottish elkhound, that's what these things are made to do. Theodore Roosevelt wrote an article about coursing pronghorn in North Dakota with packs of dogs. But in the 19th century, the practice quickly fell out of favor with regard to coursing game like deer and antelope. But it hung on much longer in regard to hunting bears and animals that were categorized as predators. So how this strategy works is you have a pack of dogs, usually some type of a hound dog. Kind of doesn't matter because it's not like you're going to use a pedigree dog for this for reasons that will become very quickly apparent. And you have this pack of dogs, you kind of just let them run loose. They find the scent of a bear or anything else, and the dogs chase the bear, and the hunters follow along on their horses. And if it's a black bear, it'll usually climb a tree, and then you just shoot it out of the tree. There's a black bear right there. There's a guy standing down there. If it's a grizzly bear, big grizzlies don't climb trees because they're too fat. They don't have the claws for it. So things are going to get beyond your control. The ideal situation is that the dogs bring the bear to bay, which means they essentially corner it so it can't run away, and then the hunter shoots the bear when it's cornered, and everyone goes home happy and healthy except for the bear. And that's the ideal situation. In actuality, a lot of dogs get killed. One swipe of a bear claw can easily dispatch a dog, if not a person. William Lay was a Western painter who spent a lot of time in Wyoming capturing scenes of Western life. And he went on a few bear hunting expeditions with the hunting guide and outfitter Ned Frost, who used dogs for bear hunting. And he captured this scene of a grizzly at bay with this hunter ready to shoot over in the left corner there. And Lay added this guy down here just for drama, you know. And you can see this is a dangerous activity, especially for dogs. And when you look closely at these dogs, you often see they're not in prime condition. You probably can't see it in the picture, but you can see their backbones, you can see their ribs. It's kind of just a skin-on-bone sort of situation. Because you're not going to spoil or pamper a dog that could very easily get killed by a bear. Unfortunately, these dogs are sort of seen as being expendable. And I told you I was going to be neutral and purely factual on this bear hunting stuff, but I do have a real problem with treating dogs as being expendable. So, non-bear hunters absolutely hate these dogs. One reason is because this category of blood sport is just moving out of fashion everywhere. But also because these packs of dogs are just so disruptive to everyone and everything out in the woods. Because they don't just chase bears, dogs chase anything. My dogs chase anything. Fortunately, other animals can just run away from these dogs. But the people who are hunting those other animals are quite understandably super annoyed when they can hear a pack of dogs barking from miles away and it disturbs everything in the valley. They don't care about the safety of the dogs, they just want to pursue their own hunting. So people start to put pressure on the state to eliminate hunting with dogs. And in 1909, the state says you can only hunt with 2 dogs on the national forest, which makes bear hunting hard, although you can still hunt mountain lions and bobcats. But then in 1912, it's straight up illegal to course bear with dogs in Wyoming. So that closes that door finally. In the 19-teens, Wyoming starts moving more in the direction of treating bears like game animals. In 1913, the state requires non-resident hunters to purchase bear hunting licenses for $10. And whether they're hunting bears as game on forest reserves or as predators in the rest of the state. I think the people in the state realized that bear hunting was a big draw and they could milk some good revenue from these bear hunters. And this slow movement of bears from being considered predators to being categorized as game animals is not popular with everyone. Certainly local people who have to live around these things are still not totally on board with protecting bears, but state wildlife managers are so slowly trying to push things in that direction. When the Wyoming Game and Fish starts doing their annual census, they count bears, which is telling because they aren't counting things like mountain lions or wolves. And you can see from these census numbers, they're not counting too many bears in the state. But also, their counting methods are probably pretty basic. But you can see from this extremely small sample in the 1920s, there's a slow but general trend upwards in bear numbers. In 1920, bears are added explicitly to the general hunting license, initially at no limit. So you just buy a license and you can go out and hunt as many bears as you can find. In 1924, there's finally a limit put on of 1 grizzly and 2 black bear. And I know this general license reads 1 grizzly and 2 brown bear, but we talked about species confusion, and we also just need to address that people need to have better proofreaders back in the 1920s. Non-resident hunters could purchase a $25 bear permit to hunt up to 3 bears in specific areas designated by the state game commissioner. Now, this liberal bag limit of 3 bears was, in retrospect, way too generous. But the state also doesn't want to protect the bear population too much because a good portion of Wyoming residents just don't want to have these things around. And we end up with this weird push and pull between Wyoming ranchers and livestock producers on the one hand, and resident and non-resident hunters on the other. And the game and fish is sort of stuck in the middle of these people, I think a place that they're probably pretty used to being at. And bear hunting eventually sort of settles into this double policy, not unlike how wolves are managed today, where they're protected on national forests and not protected in the rest of the state. So although bear hunters still need to buy a hunting license no matter where they're hunting bears. So they're no longer predators, it's no longer a shoot on sight sort of policy. And back in the days before hunting areas were introduced, in the late 1940s, there was this system of Wyoming game preserves, which was an additional way to protect wildlife in these very specific areas. See, there's game preserves mostly up in northwest Wyoming, but they're all throughout the state. And hunting on these game preserves had spring and fall seasons and were under a special permit system controlled by Game and Fish. But this system was frustratingly fickle. Sometimes they would issue permits to these hunting parties, and these groups would kill lots and lots of bears at no limit, way too many, way beyond what was sustainable. And then some other years, Game and Fish just wouldn't issue any permits. So in addition to buying your general hunting license to legally hunt bears, you might also have to buy your separate spring bear hunting license if you don't want to hunt in the fall. You might also have to buy a separate permit to hunt bears on national forest land, but off game preserves. You might also have to buy a separate permit to hunt on game preserves, but on national forests. And if you're confused by all this, you should be, because it's a little bit ridiculous. And people complain about how complex our modern hunting regulations are. Another factor in this bear hunting mess is the Wyoming outfitting industry, because bringing non-residents into the state was somewhat lucrative. Wyoming is known as one of the few places in the lower 48 where you can actually have access to grizzly bears. And this was another reason the state game managers never closed the lid too tightly on bear hunting, because it generated revenue that people liked for both outfitters and the state. Because when you require all of these different permits, it's to hunt bears in areas that bears actually are in the national forest and on these preserves, it's hard to just voluntarily turn off that cash flow. And people from all over the world come to Wyoming to hunt grizzly bears. They don't really care about black bears. And one of these hunters I need to specifically acknowledge was the author Ernest Hemingway, who came to a Dude Ranch up in northwest Wyoming in the Clarks Fork about a decade in the 1930s. And he came to Wyoming to do a lot of things: fishing, elk hunting, sheep hunting, try to get some riding done, maybe some drinking done, horseback riding. And Hemingway had hunted bears before, but he had really wanted to hunt grizzly bears. And he ends up shooting multiple bears over the years. He shoots a big black bear. He shoots 2 grizzlies in 1 year. And I'm not sure how that was legal, because like I said, there was a limit on 1 bear, but I'm not entirely sure how rigidly that was enforced. And just for the record, Hemingway shoots these bears over bait. He usually has a hunting guide or a ranch hand go up in the mountains, shoot a horse or a mule, and then he would go up a few days later and kind of see if there were any bears in the area. Now, for a few decades, Wyoming's bear population had been holding its own, or even slowly growing. But with the explosion of recreational hunting following World War II, there's just so much more pressure put on these bear populations. And importantly, they're listed as game animals in the entire state, so there are seasons and you have to buy a license. But for most of the state, bear hunting is not a limited quota system. So every person can go bear hunting every year if they want to. All they have to do is buy a general license. Now obviously that doesn't mean every hunter has a good chance of getting a bear, but there are potentially a lot of hunters in Wyoming out looking for bears. In 1947, Game and Fish reported 142 bears killed by hunters. And they make no distinction between black bears and grizzlies, all just bears. In 1948, they report 352 bears killed by hunters. And in that same 2-year period, they report 143 bears killed as predators, not as game animals. So by shepherds or ranchers, they're killing cattle or something. So in that 2-year period, over 600 bears are killed in the state, and those are the only ones they knew about. And the astonishing thing was, those 600 bears were almost half of the entire estimated bear population in the entire state. So clearly something's a little bit weird here. In 1949, the estimated grizzly population in the state is only 77. And state game managers seem to acknowledge dwindling bear populations as a problem, but for a variety of reasons, they don't really seem to do much about it. even though they acknowledge these policies of discrimination. And the obvious question here is why didn't state game and fish do anything to curb declining bear populations? And I think it goes back to that old perception of bears inhabiting this weird gray area between being predators and being game animals. And you can make the argument that game and fish could just never get past that dichotomy. And they were sort of paralyzed with inaction when it came to protecting bears, especially grizzly bears. State game managers also had to answer to the people of Wyoming, so it's not like it's totally their fault. A lot of these people do not want to see robust and protected bear populations because these residents are the folks who are going to have to deal with the vast majority of human-bear conflicts. And I should note that this population drop is kind of uneven because black bears can recover their numbers fairly quickly and they can adapt to changing environments a lot easier than grizzlies. Grizzly bears are eliminated in most of Wyoming by 1900, kind of except in a few small pockets in northwest Wyoming. They're gone from the bighorns by 1911, and they don't come back. Despite what people assume, animals always come back if you leave them alone. They don't come back. And this is largely because game and fish couldn't treat black bears and grizzly bears separately, apart from allowing hunters to hunt one grizzly and 2 black bears. But eventually, the Wyoming grizzly population reaches such a crisis point that Game and Fish starts managing the bears as separate species in 1968, which is obviously way too late, because they were concerned in 1968 that the population was declining. But I mean, it had been declining for 100 years, and no one cared at all. So grizzlies were taken off the general hunting license and placed on a special permit system. And this was nothing new because Game and Fish had been using the special permit system for antelope and moose since the early 1900s. They could have moved grizzly bears over to the special permit system decades before. And even this didn't stop the decline. In Park County, where I'm from, in 1970 there were 20 special grizzly permits, 18 in 1971, 16 in 1972, and 8 in 1974. And then we all know in 1975, grizzlies were placed on as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. And this resulted in grizzly management being taken away from Wyoming and placed in the responsibility of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And obviously, grizzly bear hunting stopped entirely. In 1988, black bears were removed from being included on the general license and were sold separately as standalone general tags. They're still not a limited quota hunting species. So currently, black bears they're not like special permits. Anyone can go buy a hunting license. You can go buy one right now and go hunt a bear in the spring or the fall. There's no, you don't have to enter a lottery, is what I'm saying. But there is a female mortality limit for each hunting area, where if that number of sows, usually it's about 5 or 10, gets killed, Game and Fish will end the season in that area. And as most of you probably know, when grizzly bears were listed in 1975, the population was like around 100, a little more. And the Wyoming grizzly population has now reached nearly 800 bears, if not more. And there's been multiple efforts in recent years to delist grizzlies. One in 2007 that didn't stick. Another just recently in 2017 that didn't stick. So we'll see how that goes. So that's the brief history of bear hunting. And before I wrap things up, I just want to acknowledge that the actions of a lot of these historic bear hunters can be really hard on our modern sensibilities, no matter how you feel about bear hunting in general. It's easy to get irritated when we hear stories about some hunter shooting bear cubs, shooting bears in traps, shooting bears that are now endangered species. But these people were operating with very different notions of the place bears were meant to occupy in nature and in the scheme of Wyoming wildlife. And in those days, bears were just meant to be thinned out. And these folks were just acting on these very commonly held assumptions. Now, these assumptions and cultural attitudes become problematic when the policies and regulations which were a product of that mindset were not altered or discarded when the bear population in Wyoming was not as it was back then, and also when public attitudes were generally changing about what place bears ought to occupy on our Wyoming landscape. Because as time went on, people did care a lot about bears. A lot of locals cared about bears. A lot of hunters cared about bears. There are a lot of hunters today that are still a little bit iffy about the whole topic of bear hunting, because they don't really think that hunting that's for something that you wouldn't eat is ethically kosher. But despite all that, the historic policies of ignoring Wyoming bear populations and really doing nothing to protect them was perpetuated way longer than it should have been, until the Endangered Species Act took away state management of grizzly bears. So that's it. Thanks for hanging with me in this 30 to 40 minute program that I was told to give. And if you have any questions, I know this is a juicy topic. I'd be happy to answer or deflect any angry or spirited comments you have.
One question.
Yeah.
You said Maine, they can still trap bears. Are they leg hold traps, or are they those barrel type traps like the game and fish catches?
I think they're leg hold traps.
Leg hold.
Anything else?
I could believe the size of some of these. Yeah, large.
Yeah, they're big.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think when you talk to people who actually deal with bears, grizzly bears are usually, people always say, well, that thing's a ton. Usually, grizzly bears are only about like 300, 400 pounds. Occasionally, they're super massive like that, but those are just freaks.
So you mentioned W.D. Pickett. We do have a letter where he describes his 4-bear night. Over one of the cases I'm here because I'm just
Thank you. Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.